So it's wash day on the frontier today. Yeah, eventually you can live in clothes only so long, and you got to do something about it. And I thought today I'd talk a wee bit of history about hygiene in the 18th century. Perhaps a better way to put it would be a lack of hygiene in the 18th century. Anyway, before I get into that topic, back to tools a bit. I think people in that time period, our ancestors living in the frontier, lived by a simple rule, and that was if you need something, you made something. So didn't have a washboard, so I whittled this out of an old chunk of walnut, and that darn thing works pretty good. Anyway, I'm going to get this thing hung up. I've got a couple more shirts I got to do here, and we'll get on to the topic of how they kept clean 300 years ago. So, as you saw, wash day isn't so easy on the frontier, and we take a lot of things for granted in our modern world, like turning on a tap for hot water. I had every vessel that would hold water here to get enough water heated to do it. But a little discussion on soap that I'm using. So a fellow by the name of Nicholas Leblanc in the 18th century, and it wasn't until the 18th century that we have soaps that we sort of know and use today, and he figured out a cheap and inexpensive way to make caustic soda, which is soap makers today call it lye, and that's the product that they used. But people in that time period, if we go back into King Louis XIV as an example, in his entire life had 2 baths. And the only reason he had those 2 baths was it was at the recommendation of his doctors, and they thought it might be a cure for these aggressive headaches that the poor old king had there. So that was their way of treating it. But they believed that medicine at the time, they believed that bathing the body in hot water opened the pores, and that let all kinds of diseases in. So the theory was, and it remained, particularly with the upper class, to not bathe. Now on the frontier, they didn't have an option. Life was dirty. They had to keep clean somehow. So whether that was as simple as a dip in the pond or the river or whatever, I can relate a modern story of keeping clean. I was once on a mountaineering expedition in Peru way back in the 80s, which dates me. And we were up high, we were on the glacier, and we were up in there for almost 6 weeks. And I was in the same clothes and hadn't had a bath. And when I got down to our base camp, I literally stripped off all my clothes. I put my long underwear that I'd been wearing for that time period, and I poured a bit of blazo on it, and I lit fire to the darn stuff. And then I had a bath in a glacial-fed lake, which was pretty darn cold. So that was a simple way of keeping clean on the frontier. But back to the aristocrats and the science at the time, believing that you shouldn't bathe, they believed that white linen that they wore as undergarments would actually absorb the impurities out of the body and thus keep them clean. In the process, it would keep the body clean. So they would have many changes of clothes, and the cravat itself was used to absorb the sweats in the neck area and what have you. And that stayed pretty much until the late 18th centuries when a fellow named Louis Pasteur discovers that, or draws a link between microbes and diseases. And it proves conclusively that washing hands is a good thing. Anyway, I'm going to pour myself a cup of coffee and we'll talk a wee bit more about this. So the lack of hygiene in that time period resulted in the proliferation of numerous diseases. And one of the major ones was body lice and fleas. So the bites from them would become infected. And the affluent weren't immune from it, but they certainly had better diet. So the poorer people were certainly more susceptible to the spread of diseases. These bites would become infected. They'd spread diseases like typhoid, parasites like tapeworms. So Louis Pasteur, who came up with this concept of microbes, and he had a tough time selling that, pitching that to his peers, because at that time they believed if you couldn't see it, it wasn't real. But because he came up with that and was able to conclusively show that these microbes carry diseases, countless lives have been saved over the centuries. All right, I'm enjoying my cup of coffee here out of a tin cup, which was probably one of the most common things in the frontier. And because it's such a nasty day outside, we've got freezing rain happening, and we've got about 3 feet of snow on the level. In fact, there's enough snow out there that I stepped down onto my front porch or veranda instead of stepping up onto it. And I'm just going to stay right by the fire today. But I thought I'll talk a little bit about the history of tin on the frontier, and it's a pretty fascinating story. I've laid out just a few items that were made from tin in the 17 and 1800s. Prior to tin becoming sort of the popular or most popular item for use was copper. So I've put out a couple of copper pieces here. But around 1720, somewhere in that time frame, tin takes over as a major industry in the colonies. So tin is made from thin steel that's dipped multiple times into molten tin. And over the course of decades, countless tons, tens of thousands of tons of hot dipped tea was shipped from England to the colonies for their tinsmiths to fabricate the items you see. The interesting thing is they had put a moratorium on the making of tin, if you would, in the colonies. So it forced them to bring these imports from England. So if we think about issues or things that led up to the American Revolution, we think of things like the Boston Tea Party, you know, that tyrant king 3,000 miles away puts a tax on their tea and such. But he also, simple things like being able to make their own products in tin in the colonies also had effect on that. So the art of tinsmithing, a tinsmith would employ apprentices, and that apprenticeship you'd think would be fairly short, but some of these items are pretty sophisticated. This is a candle mold for making beeswax or tallow candles. That apprenticeship would last anywhere from 4 to 6 years. But every town or village would have a blacksmith, but they'd also have a tinsmith. The advantages for the tinsmith, he didn't need a lot of space. This cabin would be adequate. And once the American Revolution was over and America could make their own tin, they started to make fascinating inroads in tools, hand-powered tools like the lathe I demonstrated last week, that made the manufacturing of tin products a whole lot easier. But they would always have a tinsmith in the town at busy times, and they did get busy when demand led. So an example would be during the American Revolution, you got the Continental Army and all these militia groups, and they need tin. They need tin canteens, they need mess kits, they need coffee pots, they need storage containers. Those tinsmith shops would grow in terms of the number of people required to keep up to the demand for the tin product. Anyway, I'm going to finish my coffee here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the fine artisans that produce these items that we do, because we've pretty much made everything in this cabin, including the cabin. An exception are the chairs I'm sitting on. We did purchase them, but everything else here we made ourselves. But I do not make the tin as much as I'd like to. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the Park House Museum. So the Park House Museum, they make pretty much anything out of tin that was used in the 17 and 1800s, from smallest items like candle holders and cookie cutters, to the wash basin that I used for my laundry this morning, to the best darn cooking device I've ever used. This thing, we have had more delicious meals out of this. It's commonly referred to as the Dutch oven. And not to be confused with often we call the cast iron pot as a Dutch oven, but this device dates back to sort of early 1600s, and it was used right up till when fireplaces went out of sort of favor for wood stoves. So the Park House Museum started out its life on the Detroit side of the Detroit River, and it was built in 1796 by a loyalist at the mouth of the Rouge River. And after Detroit's finally ceded back to the Americans, even though it stayed in British hands long after the treaties had been signed, he decides, well, that's enough of that. He's going to move his house. So he takes it all apart, floats it down the river with canoes, and rebuilds it on the Canadian side of the Detroit River at Amherstburg, where the Park House Museum stands to this day. And these, I can't say enough for these artisans that make this stuff. I mean, it's just second to none in terms of authenticity and quality. So yeah, that's a little shout out to them. They've certainly contribute to making our step back in time here just a touch more real. And we can kind of relate to that dissecting a log cabin, because we're going to be getting at that pretty soon. We're going to be disassembling a log cabin. We're going to be transporting it. Fortunately, I don't have to use a canoe, paddle it across any rivers, but I got to figure some way of getting it from A to B, and we're going to reassemble it as our blacksmith shop.